Hello everyone, this is King Grats here. Welcome back to the channel, guys. I'm going to be going back to my roots in this video, and I've had this swap streak video idea in my head for quite a while now. I've been doing a lot of research on stuff that could be coming up this off season just to make for content, and one of the things I thought of bringing back was the swap streak series, and where I look at a particular trade in sports history and kind of explain how it developed as the years came by, leading up to the present day, and how it impacted its respective sports league. So in this video, I'm going back to the NHL on this. I'm bringing back one particular trade that happened in 2017, and it's had a significant impact on the NHL to this day. You can argue it basically shaped the future of multiple franchises in the NHL from that one trade onwards, and leading up to the present, it has created a dramatic impact, so to speak. Technically, it was delayed, but still a major impact. So, of course, if you like this type of stuff, please don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and without further ado, I present to you the Ryan Reaves swap streak. So, for context purposes, Ryan Reaves is an NHL player who was drafted in 2005 by the St. Louis Blues at the NHL Draft. At the time, he was drafted in the 5th round, and the thing is with Reaves nowadays is that he's more of like you could say, a personality guy, more of a classic enforcer, and very much is of a dying breed of hockey players, because he's more of a known of really being a great fighter. His great skill is essentially drawing fights, throwing punches, heavy penalty minutes, physicality, and there's not really much offensive or defensive skill in his game, but it's gotten him enough success that he's been able to last in the NHL for quite some time now. So for Reaves, his career started in St. Louis. It took him a number of years, mainly being in the AHL before he eventually made it to the NHL level in 2010, 2011. And from then onwards, he basically became a big time presence for the St. Louis Blues. He would stick around with the team for pretty much the next half decade or so, being mostly that classic bottom six grinding forward who put up tons of penalty minutes. As you can see in the numbers here, according to Puckpedia, there was a number of seasons where he had at least over 100 penalty minutes, and every now and then he would chip in with some offense. And I think that's what separated Reaves from a number of other enforcers of his era, in fact that he at least had enough skill that he could last in the NHL into its transition into a more skill-based game. And essentially he could survive as like a fourth line, low-level grinder, if you will. But for Reaves, his career took a major step in a different direction as he was involved in a trade following the conclusion of the 2017 season, where the Pittsburgh Penguins at this point had just completed a repeat of the Stanley Cup championship. And of course, after some concerns about, are the Penguins going to be able to protect their star players, notably Sidney Crosby, after what happened in the postseason in 2017, they decided to get some sort of security in order to protect their top guys at a cost of not just their future, but also of their existing skill as an organization. So we have our first trade. So Ryan Reaves was traded to the Pittsburgh Penguins in June of 2017, along with a second-round pick in that year's draft for a first-round pick in 2017 and Oscar Sundqvist going back to the Blues. Now, Oscar Sundqvist was a guy who was a Penguins prospect for a while, but never really amounted to much for the Penguins at the NHL level, and was mostly buried in the minor leagues, if anything. And for Sundqvist, once he got to St. Louis, Sundqvist broke out in 2018-2019, having a fantastic season over there, and he would become a big contributor for the Blues to win their first ever Stanley Cup title in 2019 in the postseason. And he would spend a number of years with the Blues. However, he was later involved in a separate trade when the Blues began to retool, and so he was dealt this time to the Detroit Red Wings, along with Jake Wallman and a second-round pick in 2023 for veteran defenseman Nick Leddy and a minor leaguer Luke Witkowski. So, looking at this trade in hindsight, Nick Leddy is still with the Blues to this day, even though he is an aging veteran on their back end. Luke Witkowski was essentially a minor leaguer, and he hasn't been traded since, so I can't really say anything about that. For the Red Wings, Jake Wallman at the time was an unknown defensive prospect. He actually bloomed into a pretty solid offensive style defenseman who had some good talent on the back end and was helping a Red Wings team supposedly get out of a rebuild, if you will. They would retain the second round pick in 2023, which was used to select Andrew Gibson. Gibson is still a prospect with the Red Wings, so I can't say anything about him right now. But for Sundqvist, unfortunately, the Red Wings did not take another step forward in their rebuild, and he was involved in a later trade, roughly a full calendar year later, in which he was sent to the Minnesota Wild for a fourth-round pick in 2023. The Red Wings would retain this pick and would use it to select Larry Keenan, who of course hasn't really amounted to anything at the NHL level, so I'm not really expecting much from him there. Oskar Sundqvist would spend the rest of the 2023 season with Minnesota before he would ultimately leave as a free agent, so that effectively ends this part of the swap streak. For Jake Wallman, on the other hand, he would spend a little bit of time with the Red Wings, but surprisingly enough, he was involved in a separate trade in which he was basically sent to the San Jose Sharks along with a 2024 second round pick, surprisingly for future considerations. This was definitely mind-blowing because Wallman had developed into this decent top four defenseman for Detroit, and the fact that the Red Wings were just going to throw him away for basically nothing was, arguably disrespectful, and it definitely hurt them in the long run here, as they obviously got nothing back for this trade. For Wallman, he would spend some time with the Sharks as well, and the second round pick would be retained by the Sharks, and they would use this pick to select Leo Salen Wallenius out of Sweden. Of course, it's still very early to tell as to what exactly Wallenius will become, if anything, at the North American ice in the NHL level, so we'll have to wait on him there. For Wallman, he would spend a little bit of time with the Sharks before he was involved in a trade deadline trade, going to the Edmonton Oilers for prospect Carl Berglund and a 2026 conditional first-round pick. I don't know why the graphic here is technically incorrect, but trust me, that is exactly the details. Berglund and a first for Jake Wallman going to Edmonton. So in hindsight, a fantastic deal for the Sharks, as not only did they get a second round pick for picking up Wallman, but they also got a first round pick for sending him away. So that really helped out their rebuild. For Wallman, he is still with the Oilers right now as they progressed into the Western Conference Finals of the 2025 postseason. Carl Berglund, of course, is still a very young, mostly an unknown prospect for the Sharks. We'll have to see if whether or not he materializes into a bigger player for their current rebuild. But that's pretty much how things go from here. Now, looking at what the draft picks are for both these teams, for the Penguins, the 2017 second round pick turned into Zachary Lozon, who was an absolute bust for his pick, as he basically did not do anything outside of the junior leagues. So that basically ends that right there. And for the Blues, the 2017 first round pick was used to select Klim Kostin. Kostin, coming out of Russia, was kind of a late bloomer player. He did have an impact for the Blues in the 2019 Stanley Cup run, and that basically was how he materialized his career from. But he would later move on from the Blues, as he was involved in a separate trade going to the Edmonton Oilers straight up for defensive prospect Dmitry Samorukov. Samorukov hasn't been traded again since this trade, and I'm not really expecting much from him. I believe he's still a prospect with the Blues' system, so maybe he materializes into something, but it's still fairly early before then. And for Klim Kostin, he would stick around with the Oilers in order to provide McDavid and Draisaitl some okay forward depth, but he didn't really amount to much, and he was later sent along with Kailer Yamamoto to the Detroit Red Wings for future considerations. Of course, this was purely a cap dump move. For the Red Wings, they would later buy out Kailer Yamamoto, and he would then later leave to the Seattle Kraken as a free agent. For Klim Kostin, he would spend a little bit of time in Detroit before he was later involved in another trade, going straight up to the San Jose Sharks for Radim Simek. Simek was a defenseman who ultimately didn't really do much for Detroit. He basically left for, I think, Czechia at the conclusion of last season, and he is currently in Europe as we speak. For Kostin, he is still with the Sharks. I'm not expecting much from him right now. I believe I think this was his last year on his current contract, so I'm not sure if he's going to get traded again anytime soon, but I'm pretty sure this is the end of the line for at least this block of the original trade for this swap streak. Now going back to the Penguins here, so Ryan Reaves, after getting picked up for security purposes of the top guys in Pittsburgh, the bad part of this trade was that it really killed the offense for the Penguins, as in 2017-2018, this team was sort of a shell of its former self when it comes to the offensive depth. For Reaves, he was picking up a lot of penalties, but especially dumb penalties that really burned the Penguins, and he wasn't putting up enough offense for the organization, obviously. So the Penguins basically had no choice but to cut him loose. So he was involved in essentially a three-team trade in which the Ottawa Senators and the Vegas Golden Knights would get involved here, and the Penguins would basically send Ryan Reaves along with a 4th-round pick to the Vegas Golden Knights in exchange for Tobias Lindbergh, and they would also pick up from the Ottawa Senators Vincent Dunn, a 3rd-round pick in 2018, and veteran player Derek Brassard. And for the Senators, they would pick up a 1st-round pick in 2018 from Pittsburgh, goalie prospect Philip Gustafson, defenseman Ian Cole, and a 2019 3rd-round pick. So there are a lot of moving parts when it comes to this 3-team trade, and it did have a significant impact for the 2018 season. So starting off with some of the simpler parts here from Pittsburgh's side of things, Vincent Dunn, not to be confused with Vince Dunn, who is a current defenseman of Seattle Kraken, he basically didn't amount to anything outside of junior leagues, so essentially he never got traded again, so you don't have to worry about him. Derek Brassard would have his own very convoluted trade history, and I will get back to him. Looking at the Golden Knights, the 4th-round pick they got, along with the Reaves, would turn into Stanislav Demin, who basically did not amount to much, if anything at all. I believe he's still in the KHL, but I don't think he has a contract with any NHL team, so basically you can end it right there. In addition to this, Tobias Lindbergh would actually have his own trade history after his time with the Penguins. He was involved in a separate trade in which he would go this time to the Ottawa Senators along with Stefan Elliott for McCoy Urkamps and Ben Sexton. Urkamps, Sexton, and Elliott all never got traded again in their respective careers, but for Tobias Lindbergh, he was involved in a separate trade again, this time going basically back to the Vegas Golden Knights along with Mark Stone in exchange for defensive prospect Eric Brandstrom, Oscar Lindbergh, and a 2nd-round pick in 2020 going to Ottawa. So yeah, basically this is how the Golden Knights got Mark Stone, ladies and gentlemen. It actually resulted in Ryan Reaves going to Vegas, and then the Golden Knights would later pick up their captain, Mark Stone, who would help the Golden Knights win a championship in 2023. Tobias Lindbergh basically didn't amount to anything at the NHL level after all this time, and he would basically move on, going back to Sweden. Same thing with Oscar Lindbergh. He didn't really amount to anything at all. Eric Brandstrom was a former 1st-round pick of the Golden Knights, and there was a lot of hype in Ottawa that he could be a part of their incoming rebuild, and honestly he didn't really meet expectations. A lot of people thought he would be a good offensive defenseman. He really did not amount to anything at all, anything nowhere near close to what people were expecting out of him as being like a top 4 D-man. And ultimately Brandstrom basically was kind of turned aside in Ottawa, and he started trying to bounce around the NHL for a little bit before ultimately leaving, I believe, for Europe. So that's basically what we have in Brandstrom. He would never get traded again. The 2nd-round pick in 2020 that went to the Senators for Mark Stone turned into Igor Sokolov, who is currently a prospect for the organization in the AHL, but he has not played in the NHL since, and he hasn't been traded again. So we can move on from that. So moving on here, let's look at the 1st-round pick that the Sens got from the Penguins. So this first actually got flipped this time to the New York Rangers for another 1st-round pick in 2018 and a 2nd-rounder in 2018. Now, the first that the Sens got back turned into Jacob Bernard-Docker, who was supposed to be what could be a solid defensive prospect, and the 2nd-rounder turned into Jonathan Tchanek, who honestly did not amount to really anything at the NHL level at all, so kind of a bust of a pick. But for Jacob Bernard-Docker, it would take him some time to get into the NHL, and for the 1st-round pick that went to the Rangers as part of this deal, they would use this pick to select Keandre Miller. So surprisingly enough, the Rangers came out pretty well in this deal, since Miller did develop into a top 4 defenseman in New York and is still with the organization to this day. The Senators would basically keep Bernard Docker for a number of years, and as time would go on, Bernard Docker would later be involved in another trade that just happened recently, in which the Sens would send Jacob Bernard Docker along with Josh Norris for Dylan Cousins, Dennis Gilbert, and a second-round pick in 2026 coming from the Buffalo Sabres. So, yeah, interesting how this materialized in a very interesting way. Of course, Josh Norris and Bernard Docker are still with Buffalo right now. Dylan Cousins is on a pretty big contract that he signed with the Sabres in the first place, so I'm expecting him to stick around in Ottawa for the time being. Dennis Gilbert was a defenseman who was mostly a depth defenseman, and I don't expect him to really materialize into too much at this point in his career. And the second round pick in 2026 is still left to be determined, so we're just going to basically leave it there. Looking at the other pieces that Ottawa got back, Philip Gustafsson was a goalie prospect from Sweden who did have a lot of hype. There was expectations in Ottawa that he could become maybe a future starting goaltender, and he did get a lot of time in development, but things didn't really materialize for him in Ottawa. So he was later flipped in a separate trade, this time going to the Minnesota Wild straight up for Cam Talbot. And this has completely backfired if you're a Sens fan. Philip Gustafsson would later develop into a starting goaltender in Minnesota, sharing the net with now retired future Hall of Famer Marc-Andre Fleury. And Cam Talbot would have basically one whole year in Ottawa where he basically underperformed, and he would then leave in free agency. So that pretty much ends this line right here. Ian Cole, on the other hand, he was a defenseman who would later get traded as part of the Sens trying to tear down their team. He was flipped to the Columbus Blue Jackets just a few days after the original three-team trade for Nick Moutre and a third-round pick in 2020. Moutre would never get traded again. Ian Cole would leave Columbus in free agency, so we don't have to worry about that. I will keep an eye on the third-round pick because that pick surprisingly turned into something big, and I'll come back to that later. The third-round pick in 2018, on the other hand, this was later flipped by the Penguins, this time to the Colorado Avalanche for a 2018 second-round pick. The second rounder was used to select Philip Hallander, who would spend a little bit of time with the Penguins. I'll come back to him because he actually is involved in a separate trade that happens later in this video, so keep an eye on that. The third-round pick that went to Colorado was used to select Justus Annunen. Annunen was an okay goalie prospect who would spend a couple of years in Colorado, and technically this thing was quiet for a number of months after me initially making this thing. And then Annunen was later flipped to the Nashville Predators for basically Scott Wedgwood. He also was flipped with a 6th-round pick in 2025, and at this point in time, I'm not really expecting much because Annunen is at best right now probably a backup goalie in the NHL. The Predators were a tire fire this year, and he did get some time at the NHL level, but basically he has disappeared from any news sources from what I know, so I'm not really expecting much out of him. The 6th-round pick never got traded by Nashville, so I'm expecting them to hang on to that pick considering how bad they were this season. And Scott Wedgwood would become basically one of the newer goalies for the Colorado Avalanche this past season, and probably will spend some time in Colorado for the time being, so we're going to have to hang on to that right there. So let's go back with the Ian Cole trade. So as I mentioned, Ian Cole went to Columbus, never got traded again. The Sens got back Nick Moutre in a 2020 third-round pick. Moutre, of course, never got traded again, but what really keeps this part going is the third-round pick, surprisingly enough. So the third-round pick was involved in a number of trades. First of all, it was flipped by Ottawa as part of a big trade in which it was sent to the Toronto Maple Leafs along with Cody Ceci, Ben Harpur, and Aaron Luchuk in exchange for Nikita Zaitsev, Connor Brown, and Michael Carcone. So you got a lot of moving parts here. To really simplify things here right now, Cody Ceci never got traded again after he went to Toronto. He basically stuck around with the organization for about a year or so before he ultimately left as a free agent. For Ben Harpur, he was later involved in a separate trade going to Nashville for Mika Salamaki. Salamaki also never got traded again after this, as he basically kind of stuck around in Toronto's farm system but never did much at the NHL level. For Ben Harpur, he would spend a little bit of time in the NHL with Nashville, but he never got traded again. Aaron Luchuk was involved in a separate trade going back to Ottawa for Max Veronneau. Both of these guys never got traded again, and neither of them had a major impact at the NHL level either, so you can basically scratch that right there. And Luchuk was actually later traded to Montreal along with a 7th round pick in 2020, which turned into Matthew Pekka. That being what the Sens got back. Pekka, of course, didn't amount to anything at the NHL level. The 7th round pick that was given to Montreal, they would later flip this to Chicago for another 7th round pick in 2021, and then that 7th round pick got flipped to Arizona for another 7th round pick, this time in 2022. So the 2022 7th turned into Miguel Tourigny, who of course didn't amount to anything. The 2021 7th turned into Sam Lipkin, also never heard of this guy. Chicago got out better in this trade because basically the 7th round pick in 2020 they got from Montreal was used to select Louis Crevier. And Crevier is a defensive prospect for Chicago who has played, at least in this point, at around 100 plus NHL games, which is pretty good for a 7th round selection. So props to him. I know I should have this probably on the visuals here, but it would have been very complicated for people's eyes. So I just trying to save everyone from having to look at this. So just follow with my voice here. But yeah, that's basically end of the line right there. With the other pieces now on the Senators side of things, Michael Carcone, he would later be involved in a separate trade in which he would go to the Nashville Predators from Ottawa for Zachary Magwood. Magwood was basically a minor league prospect who really did not amount to anything at the NHL level, so you don't got to worry about him. Carcone, he would spend a lot more time in the NHL recently in the newly minted Utah franchise through what was then the Arizona Coyotes, but it did not involve him getting traded there. When it comes to the 3rd round pick, after going to Toronto, it was later flipped to the LA Kings, along with Trevor Moore and a conditional 3rd round pick in 2021 for Jack Campbell and Kyle Clifford. So this is how the Leafs basically developed their existing kind of goalie tandem that they had at the time around Frederik Andersen. Trevor Moore would develop into a pretty solid NHL player. He would amount to, at least at best, a top 6, top 9 forward with the LA Kings. The Kings would hang on to the 3rd round pick in 2020 and would use it to select Alex Laferriere, who did amount to a pretty solid, at least at best, top 9 forward right now in the NHL level. The conditional 3rd round pick was also used to select Cameron Wynot, because why not? And Wynot, of course, did not amount to anything at the NHL level, so you could basically end that right there. For Jack Campbell and Kyle Clifford, both of these guys never got traded from Toronto. Clifford basically would get exiled to the AHL, and he's been stuck with the Leafs farm system ever since. For Jack Campbell, on the other hand, he would spend a couple of years in Toronto where he finally blossomed into what could have been a solid, goaltender at the starting caliber level before he ultimately left as a free agent to Edmonton, and his entire career fell off a cliff. So you can basically end that right there. Now, looking at what Ottawa has as well, Nikita Zaitsev was basically a cap dump going to Ottawa, and he would spend a number of years in their rebuild before he was later flipped to the Chicago Blackhawks, along with a 2nd round pick in 2023 and a 4th round pick in 2026, all for future considerations. Zaitsev's contract would essentially expire with the Blackhawks, and he would later leave for Russia, so we can essentially end that right there. Of course, Ottawa got nothing back as part of this trade, and the 4th round pick in 2026 is to be determined, so you don't have to worry about that. The 2nd round pick in 2023, however, that was later used to select Roman Kotsarov, and of course this hasn't amounted to much at this point in time. I still believe the Blackhawks do retain his rights though, so maybe he becomes something, but at this point we can't really say. For Connor Brown, however, he would spend a little bit of time in Ottawa before he was later involved in a separate trade in which he went this time to the Washington Capitals in exchange for a 2nd round pick in 2024. So for Connor Brown, after spending a little bit of time in Washington, he would later leave as a free agent as things kind of took a turn for the worst in his career, and he basically kind of fell off a cliff when it comes to production, but he would find things once again when he got to Edmonton. For the Senators in the 2024 second round pick, it was later involved in a massive trade in which Ottawa would send that pick to the then Arizona Coyotes, along with a conditional first in 2023 and a second round pick in 2026, all for Jakob Chychrun. Of course, Chychrun at this time was a highly coveted defenseman who a lot of people were thinking of him being potentially getting traded. He was trade bait for a while at this time. For the Coyotes, what they got back in this trade, the 2023 conditional first was transferred to the Coyotes, and they used this to select Daniil Boo, who was essentially one of the very few players left who have been drafted by the Coyotes before they were relocated to Utah. The second round pick in 2024 was also acquired by Arizona at the time, so they held on to this pick. The second round pick in 2026 is to be determined, so can't say anything about that right now. When you look at Jakob Chychrun, he wouldn't spend too much time in Ottawa because there wasn't that great of a fit, so he was later flipped to the Washington Capitals in exchange for Nick Jensen and a third round pick in 2026. For Chychrun, of course, he would blossom into the offensive style of defenseman in Washington for the Capitals this year, and he would get a massive contract extension to stay with the Caps, so we can basically end things right there. For Nick Jensen, he was a decent top six defenseman who has stuck around with Ottawa to this point, so we haven't seen him get traded again. And of course, the Sens still own this third round pick in 2026, which is to be determined, so we don't have to worry about that. The conditional second rounder that the Coyotes got back was later flipped by what was at this point the Utah Hockey Club, along with a 2025 second round pick to the New Jersey Devils to acquire John Marino and a fifth round pick in the 2024 draft. The 2024 second was used to select Mikhail Yegorov, who of course hasn't left Russia at this point in time, coming from the KHL, so there's still a lot of time left here for the Devils to figure this out. They still have the second round pick in 2025, and there's still a lot left to be said about that pick. For the Utah Hockey Club, they would retain the fifth round pick in 2024 and would use it to select Ales Čech, who I believe is a defensive prospect from Czechia. Correct me if I'm wrong there, but he is still in Utah's system, but I don't believe he has a current contract yet. So essentially we can kind of end things right there. And of course, John Marino is still with Utah, so we can essentially stop things at this point. Now moving on, we're called Derek Brassard. Basically, Derek Brassard, after spending a lot of time with the Senators and getting involved in that three-team trade, essentially he had a chunk of his contract getting retained by the Vegas Golden Knights at this time, and him going to Pittsburgh. So Derek Brassard has his own unique trade history. Initially, he was with Pittsburgh, and he was then flipped this time to the Florida Panthers, along with Riley Sheahan, a pair of fourth-round picks in 2019, and a second-round pick in 2019 in exchange for Jared McCann and Nick Bjugstad. Bjugstad was a veteran piece who was seen as a really good forward. Unfortunately, he never got traded again. He was supposed to get traded to the Minnesota Wild for what would have been a conditional seventh round pick in 2021 because he wasn't going to sign in Pittsburgh, but the conditions were never met. So basically, it was future considerations if you think about it. For Jared McCann, he was retained by Pittsburgh for a while, but he was later flipped to the Toronto Maple Leafs for, as I mentioned, Philip Hallander. They got him back, and a seventh round pick in 2023. This was all basically done in preparation for the Seattle expansion draft when the Kraken came into the NHL. Jared McCann would later get picked up from the Leafs by Seattle in the expansion draft as he was left unprotected, so that essentially ends the line here. For Philip Hallander, he is still with the Pittsburgh Penguins, and the seventh round pick in 2023 was used to select Emil Järventie. Järventie, honestly, we haven't heard much about him since him getting drafted, and I'm not expecting much to come out of this selection. So unfortunately, this kind of ends the line right there. Now, looking at what the Panthers got back, Riley Sheahan never got traded again as part of his career after going to Florida, so this basically ends the line for him. Derek Brassard, he was later involved in a separate trade in which he was sent to, this time, the Colorado Avalanche, along with a conditional sixth round pick in 2020 in exchange for a third round pick in 2020. When you look at these pieces right here, the third round pick that went back to Florida was used to select Justin Sourdiff, who is one of the very few prospects left in the Panthers farm system right now. And the 6th rounder in 2020 was used to select Niels Aman, who I believe basically didn't sign with the Avalanche. He did make it to the NHL, but not with Colorado. It was with Vancouver, and I believe he actually left as an unsigned drafted free agent. So that basically kind of ends the line right here. When it comes to the 4th round pick and 2nd round picks, the 2nd rounder in 2019 was used to select Vladislav Kolyachonok, and the 4th round picks were used to select Dmitry Voronkov and Eric Hjorth. And if you're a Blue Jackets fan, you're probably wondering, wait, Voronkov? Didn't the Jackets draft him? And yes, you are correct. Vladislav Kolyachonok, first of all, he was later involved in a separate trade in which the Arizona Coyotes would acquire Kolyachonok, who was a defensive prospect, along with Captain Anton Strawman, and a 2024 2nd round pick in exchange for a 7th round pick in 2023. The 2nd rounder was used to select Will Skahan, who at this point in time I don't really know much about, but at least he's still in the Utah Hockey Club's system right now. Anton Strawman basically was a cap dump here. He would spend pretty much most of his career already basically on the sidelines, and his contract would expire with the Coyotes. For Kolyachonok, he never got traded again, and I believe is still with Utah as a prospect. Just not entirely sure of it at this point. The 2 4th round picks were used and sent to another trade, this time to the Columbus Blue Jackets, for a 2019 3rd round pick. And of course, the 4th rounders were used by the Blue Jackets to select Voronkov and Eric Hjorth. Hjorth didn't amount to anything, but Voronkov did amount to a pretty solid goal-scoring forward for the Blue Jackets, as he has broken out at least over the last 2 or so years. So it's nice to see for them. For the Panthers, they would use the 3rd round pick they got back in this deal to select Cole Schwindt, who hasn't really amounted to much at the NHL level, but Schwindt would be involved in a major trade in which he was sent to the Calgary Flames along with Jonathan Huberdeau, Mackenzie Weegar, and a 1st round pick in 2025 in exchange for Matthew Tkachuk and a 4th round pick in 2025. And there you go, ladies and gentlemen. Somehow Ryan Reaves going from St. Louis to Pittsburgh in 2017 led to Matthew Tkachuk going to the Florida Panthers. Of course, it's still too early to tell as to what we can say about this big blockbuster, but Jonathan Huberdeau, who got a big contract extension with the Flames after this trade, he basically has been a shell of his former self, at least to this point. Mackenzie Weegar is now the Flames' top defenseman as they now transition into a big rebuild. Cole Schwindt, he was supposed to be an okay prospect, but he hasn't really amounted to much for the Flames. And the 1st round pick in 2025 is, I believe, going to Calgary. There's still much to be said about that pick, at least coming up in this year's draft. The conditional 4th, of course, I believe is still going to Florida. Obviously, we can't say anything about this pick. And Matthew Tkachuk has had a fantastic career so far as a Florida Panther. So we can basically kind of end that block right there. Now, just trying to finish up with Ryan Reaves. After he went to Vegas, he would spend a number of years with the Golden Knights, but of course his time was overdue with Vegas, and he would later be involved in a pair of trades after his time with the Golden Knights. So first he was flipped as basically a cap dump to the New York Rangers for a 3rd round pick in 2020, and then later Reaves would spend a little bit of time with the Rangers before he was later flipped in a separate trade, this time going to the Minnesota Wild for a 5th round pick in 2025. The Rangers would retain the 5th round pick. We still don't really know what that pick is going to be right now. For Reaves, he would spend the rest of that season in 2022 with the Minnesota Wild before he would leave in free agency to the Toronto Maple Leafs, where he currently resides, basically straddling the line between the NHL and the AHL at this point. And considering that this year is his final contract with the Leafs organization, I'm not really sure what his career is going to look like moving forward, but I'm pretty sure this is probably the end of the line for his trade history. So when it comes to the 3rd round pick for the Golden Knights, this pick was actually used to select Nicholas Moldenhauer, but it was actually sent to the Toronto Maple Leafs along with a 5th round pick in 2022 for an earlier 3rd round selection in the same draft, which course, the Golden Knights used that earlier third to select Jordan Gustafsson. For the Leafs, they would use the third in 2020 to select Nicholas Moldenhauer and the 5th round pick to select Nikita Grabenkin. Interestingly enough, Grabenkin has been the only guy out of these 3 players to actually play in the NHL. Grabenkin did get a cup of coffee with the Leafs before he was later involved in another big trade at this year's trade deadline, going to the Philadelphia Flyers along with a 1st round pick in 2027 for Scott Laughton, a 4th rounder in 2025, and a 6th round selection in 2027. I'm not sure what Grabenkin's career is going to look like, considering he's going to a Flyers team that is pretty much in the middle of a rebuild at this point. The 1st round pick, of course, is still with the Flyers. Scott Laughton does have another year on his contract with the Leafs, and Toronto still owns those 2 lower round draft picks that they have. For Vegas, in the original trade, Jordan Gustafsson did sign an entry-level deal with the Golden Knights, but he hasn't made an impact at the NHL level yet. And for Nicholas Moldenhauer, I believe he's still on the Leafs reserve prospect list, but I believe he's still playing in the NCAA, if I'm correct. So I don't really have much information on him, but I don't expect him to make too much of an impact at this point in time. So that's basically it. This is pretty much Reaves' entire swap streak history. As you can tell, that there are still a lot of moving parts, notably draft picks here that we still don't have a lot of information of, but it really is amazing to see how these guys went. And honestly, it would be interesting to maybe revisit this in a couple of years' time just to see how things went. There's probably going to be more stuff coming in on it. But yeah, that's the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content like this one. And yeah, thank you so much. I'll see you all in my next video.